The air was thick as Michael stepped through the crumbling gate of the old Santa Clara Textile Mill. He had heard stories about this place, whispers of tragedy and horror that no one ever dared to fully explain. The rusted metal creaked ominously as the wind pushed against it, as if warning him to turn back. But something about the place called to him, something dark and irresistible. The sky above was choked with clouds, casting the entire area in a heavy, oppressive gloom. Each step he took seemed to echo louder than the last, his footsteps swallowed by the vast silence of the mill's courtyard. The towering chimneys stood like sentinels, blackened by time and soot, and the broken windows stared down at him like empty, soulless eyes. Inside, the air was colder. A musty scent of decay and burnt fabric clung to the walls, mixing with a faint, acrid odor that Michael couldn't quite place. The place felt alive in its stillness, as though something was watching from the shadows. He moved further in, past rows of rusted sewing machines that sat motionless under layers of dust, yet he swore he could hear the faint hum of machinery. His breath caught as a fleeting sound broke the silence. The soft, rhythmic click of a sewing needle puncturing fabric, though nothing around him moved. His eyes darted around, but the room remained as it was, frozen in time. A sense of dread washed over him. It was as if the very air carried the weight of countless souls, trapped in the moment of their death. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating him with the past horrors of the place. There were burn marks along the floor, blackened streaks where the fire had licked hungrily, claiming everything in its path. As he walked further into the mill, he spotted something odd, the faint outline of a handprint, smeared in soot on the wall. It was fresh. His heart pounded in his chest. The stories had said that the workers never left. The fire had taken their bodies, but their souls remained. Suddenly, the dim lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. He heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, like someone was stalking him. But when he spun around, there was nothing. Only the cold, empty room staring back at him. His pulse quickened as he moved forward, desperate to leave, but too entranced by the mill's dark secrets to stop. The further he ventured, the more the temperature dropped, the very air turning icy. He could feel it in his bones, a chill that wasn't just from the cold. It was fear. Something in this place wanted him to stay. Then he saw it. At the far end of the hall, through the shattered remains of a door, was a figure. It stood motionless, cloaked in shadow, just beyond the reach of the weak light filtering through the broken windows. Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was undeniable. It was watching him. His skin prickled, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he couldn't move, paralyzed by an inexplicable force. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Michael's heart raced, his hands shaking as he stumbled backward, the room around him spinning. Something was terribly wrong here, something far worse than the stories had told. The floor beneath him creaked, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on it. And for a brief moment, he thought he could hear the faintest sound of distant screams, carried on the wind like a ghostly echo of the night the mill burned. Michael's pulse still thudded in his ears as he backed away from the spot where the figure had vanished. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Was it a trick of the light, his imagination running wild? Or was there truly something lurking in the shadows of the Santa Clara Mill? He felt the weight of the air pressing against him, as if the very walls carried the burden of forgotten secrets, and it was then that his eyes fell on something familiar in the dust-covered wreckage. Among the debris, barely visible beneath layers of soot and ash, was an object that sent a cold shiver down his spine. A small, wooden toy train. It was worn with age, the paint chipped and faded, but unmistakably the same toy from his childhood. He had played with it endlessly as a boy, a relic from a time when his family still spoke of the mill with pride, before the fire, before everything changed. His hands trembled as he reached for it, lifting it from the ground. How could it be here? His grandfather had given him this very toy, and he distinctly remembered losing it years ago, never to be found. Yet, here it was, as if it had been waiting for him all along. A flood of repressed memories surged to the surface, images he had long buried in the back of his mind. His grandfather had worked at this very mill, but he had never spoken of it after the fire. The old man would only mention the place in passing, his voice tinged with fear and regret, warning Michael to stay away from it. There was one night in particular that haunted Michael's memory. His grandfather had returned home late, his face pale, his arms covered in soot. He had a deep, jagged scar running down his forearm, one he refused to explain. That night, he had tucked Michael into bed and sung an eerie lullaby, one Michael hadn't heard before and would never hear again, until now. The haunting melody drifted through the air, soft but unmistakable, like a whisper from the past. It echoed faintly through the corridors of the mill, carried by the cold, stale breeze. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as the realization dawned on him. It was the same lullaby his grandfather had sung all those years ago, but no one was there to sing it. The notes seemed to rise from the very walls, as if the building itself was remembering. The scar, the lullaby, the fire, it all connected to this place. Michael's mind raced, piecing together fragments of his past that he had long tried to forget. His grandfather had spoken of strange occurrences at the mill before the fire, of unexplained noises and shadows that moved where no light should be. The scar, he had said, came from something that didn't belong, something that lived in the factory's walls, something dark and ancient. But no one had believed him. Everyone thought it was just the ramblings of an old man broken by tragedy. Yet now, standing in the ruins of the mill, Michael could feel it too. There was something here, something that had always been here, lurking beneath the surface. His grandfather had tried to protect him from it, but now it was too late. The lullaby grew louder, more distinct, as though it were wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the mill. The toy train in his hand felt unnaturally cold, as if it had absorbed the decades of darkness that permeated the place. Suddenly, pain shot through his arm. Michael gasped, dropping the train, and looked down to see a thin, red line forming across his forearm, a cut identical to the one his grandfather had. It burned as if freshly made, though nothing had touched him. Panic surged through him. The mill wasn't just haunted by memories of the fire, it was alive with them. The past was reaching out, pulling him back into its grip, demanding to be remembered. The scar, the toy, the lullaby, they were all warnings, signs that his family's history with this place ran deeper than he ever knew. But what did it mean? And why now? His breath came in shallow gasps as the realization hit him. Whatever had scarred his grandfather, whatever had caused the fire, wasn't finished. It had been waiting, lying dormant all these years, and now, with Michael here, it had woken up. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the air thickening as the darkness closed in around him. He could hear faint voices now, whispers just beyond his understanding, calling his name, beckoning him deeper into the mill. His legs felt heavy, but he couldn't stop himself from moving forward. There was a secret buried here, one his family had never spoken of, one that connected him to the factory in ways he was only beginning to understand. And whatever it wasn't going to let him leave. Michael's head throbbed with the weight of forgotten memories and the chilling realization that the mill was not just haunted, it was alive, feeding on something deeper, darker. The burning scar on his arm pulsed in time with his rapid heartbeat as he stumbled deeper into the mill, drawn to a place he could not explain. The air was suffocating now, thick with the acrid stench of smoke, though the fire had long since been extinguished. Yet, it was as if the flames were still there, licking at the edges of his vision, threatening to consume him at any moment. He found himself standing before a rusted door, partially hidden beneath debris and ash. The door was slightly ajar, the gap revealing only darkness beyond. But there was something else, a faint rhythmic sound like the soft clicking of sewing machines, accompanied by low, muffled voices. It was as if the factory was still in operation, locked in some eternal cycle. Michael's pulse quickened. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but his body moved of its own accord, pushing the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing down the long, forgotten hallway. Inside, the room was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The sewing machines were motionless now, but something else was there, waiting for him. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, hovered in the corner, its form shifting in and out of focus like smoke caught in the wind. Michael's heart raced as he felt its eyes, or whatever passed for them, lock onto him. The figure was not human, and yet there was something familiar in its presence, as if it had been waiting for him, expecting him. As he stepped closer, the figure seemed to solidify, and its face became clearer. It was the face of one of the mill workers, her features twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and filled with torment. She reached out, her fingers charred and blackened, like the victims of the fire that had ravaged the factory. "Help us," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo that sent chills down Michael's spine. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls shrinking as the figure moved closer, her voice growing more desperate. "Free us, or join us." Michael recoiled, every fiber of his being screaming to flee, but something held him in place. He realized with dawning horror that this was the impossible choice the mill had brought him here to face. The woman's form flickered as she spoke again, her voice sharper now, more urgent. "You must choose," she hissed, "before the fire takes you too." The air around Michael grew hotter, as if the flames were returning, rising from the past to claim him as they had claimed so many others. His vision blurred, and for a moment he saw it. The fire, raging uncontrollably, consuming everything in its path. The screams of the workers echoed in his ears, their faces twisted in agony as they were trapped by the inferno. And then, just as quickly, the vision vanished, leaving him gasping for breath in the oppressive silence of the room. The woman's form shifted again, and suddenly, there was another presence in the room, a small, shadowy figure that Michael instantly recognized. It was himself, a child, clutching the wooden toy train, the one he had just found in the rubble. The boy stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, and in that moment, Michael understood. This place wasn't just haunted by the ghosts of the dead. It was haunted by the choices people had made, the sacrifices they had been forced to endure. The woman's voice cut through his thoughts. "You must give something up," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "The darkness that binds us cannot be broken unless you make the sacrifice." Michael's mind raced as the impossible choice loomed before him. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the cold hand of fate wrapping itself around his throat. The first option was clear but terrifying. He could sacrifice one of his most precious memories, the last connection he had to his grandfather, the one person who had tried to warn him about this place. If he gave it up, he would free the souls trapped here, but that part of his past would be lost forever, erased from his mind. But there was another option, one far darker and more dangerous. The woman's hollow eyes gleamed as she spoke the words Michael had been dreading. "Or," she whispered, "you can take the darkness into yourself, absorb it, contain it." The consequences of such a choice were beyond comprehension. By taking on the mill's malevolent energy, Michael would become its new guardian, cursed to carry the burden of the fire and the souls lost in it. He would become part of the mill's history, tied to it forever, a living vessel of its darkness. As he stood there, the heat rising around him, his mind reeled with the weight of the decision. The visions of the fire returned, flickering in and out of his consciousness. He saw the charred bodies of the workers, their eyes staring blankly at him, accusing him, begging him. He felt the pain in his arm intensify, the scar burning as if the fire itself had reignited within him. Time seemed to stretch and warp, and Michael realized that no matter what he chose, there would be no turning back. The mill was demanding its price, and the cost would be unbearable. If he sacrificed his memory, he would lose the last piece of his family's history, but he would free the trapped souls. If he took on the darkness, he would forever be linked to this cursed place, his life intertwined with the mill's malevolent energy. The flames licked closer, and the shadows pressed in. Michael's heart raced, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The woman's voice echoed in his mind. "Choose, before the fire consumes us all." Michael's heart raced as he stood frozen in the room, the weight of his impossible choice pressing down on him. The air around him had grown thick, suffocating, like the walls themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting with each strained breath he took. The faint flicker of light from the broken windows cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor, slithering toward him as if alive. Everything in the room felt wrong, distorted by an unseen force. And then, in the oppressive silence, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, slipping through the cracks in the walls like an insidious breeze. At first, the whisper was incomprehensible, a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Michael's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing, only the empty machines, rusted and silent. But the whisper persisted, growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, merging into a chaotic symphony of anguish and desperation. He could hear them now, the voices of the dead, the workers who had perished in the flames, their souls still trapped within the mill's decaying walls. They were calling out to him, begging for release, their words fractured and disjointed, but the message was clear. They were not alone. The shadows on the floor began to writhe, curling and twisting as if alive, taking on grotesque shapes that danced just beyond the edge of his vision. Michael blinked, trying to shake the image from his mind, but the shadows didn't disappear. They grew thicker, darker, creeping up the walls, enveloping the room in a deep, unnatural gloom. His body tensed as the temperature plummeted, a bone-deep chill settling into the air. It was the coldness of death, the kind that seeped into your soul and drained you of warmth and life. Suddenly, the sewing machines, the ones that had been silent and still moments ago, began to move. The metallic click of needles piercing fabric echoed through the room, but there was no fabric beneath them, no hands guiding the machines. They worked on their own, possessed by some unseen force, the rhythmic clatter growing louder and louder, reverberating off the walls like a relentless drumbeat. Michael backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to stretch on forever, warping around him like a twisted maze. He was trapped. And then the whisper became clear, sharp, a voice cutting through the chaos. "Michael," it called, the sound slithering through the air like serpent. It was not a plea. It was a command. His breath hitched in his throat as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape. We are waiting." The voice was disembodied, its tone cold and hollow, dripping with malice and something far worse, recognition. It knew him. The shadows surged forward, rising from the floor like smoke, taking form. Faces began to emerge from the darkness. Twisted, agonized faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their features distorted by pain and fear. They floated toward him, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. Michael's heart pounded as the figures drew closer, their whispering voices blending into a cacophony of madness. "We are waiting for you," they chanted, their words overlapping, filling the room with an oppressive sense of inevitability. His vision blurred as the shadows wrapped around him, cold and suffocating, their touch like ice against his skin. He could feel them now, tugging at him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The room swayed, and for a moment, he thought he could see something beyond the shadows, a world twisted by the mill's dark history, a place where time itself had warped and fractured. There were glimpses of fire, flashes of charred bodies, workers screaming as the flames consumed them, their eyes locked on him with desperate, pleading gazes. But the worst part was the sense of familiarity. He had seen this before, not in person, but in his dreams, nightmares that had plagued him since childhood. The mill was playing tricks on his mind, bending reality, twisting the space around him until nothing made sense. He felt himself slipping, his grip on sanity loosening as the voices swirled around him, pulling him into their endless spiral of torment. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the shadows whispering his name over and over again, each repetition a little louder, a little more urgent. Michael's hands trembled as he tried to shut it out, to block the noise, but the voices were inside his head now, burrowing deep into his mind, clawing at his thoughts. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the shadows. It wasn't like the others, not a ghostly apparition of a worker trapped in the fire. This was something else, something far older, far more dangerous. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its face obscured by darkness. But Michael could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into him like a knife. The air around him grew heavier, pressing down on him with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its power suffocating. The whispering voices fell silent as the figure approached, the only sound now the soft creak of the floor beneath its feet. Michael's chest tightened, his pulse quickening as the figure stopped just a few feet away. It stood there, motionless, watching him. And then, in a voice as cold as the grave, it spoke. "You belong to us now." The words were a death sentence, final and absolute. Michael's vision swam as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around him like tendrils of darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking, the light fading. He tried to move, to run, but his body was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of the mill's dark power. The figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating, as the shadows whispered his name one last time. And then everything went black. Michael's world was swallowed by darkness. But in that void, fear took root. The cold, suffocating grip of the mill's shadows constricted around him, pulling him deeper into an abyss where reality blurred and terror thrived. His breath was ragged, each gasp of air filling his lungs with the stench of decay and smoke. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw fleeting shapes, twisted forms shifting in and out of view, like nightmares made flesh, waiting just beyond the edges of his perception. His mind, already strained by the unnatural horrors he had witnessed, began to fracture. Doubt crept in, gnawing at the corners of his sanity. Was any of this real? Or was he merely losing himself in a nightmare from which there was no waking? The line between the physical and the psychological dissolved as he stood there, paralyzed by the weight of his own dread. The mill wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the dead. It was a living thing, feeding off his fear, twisting it into something tangible, something monstrous. Then, the whispers returned, slithering through the darkness like venomous snakes. But this time they were different. They weren't just the voices of the dead. They were his own thoughts, amplified and distorted by the malevolent presence of the mill. Asterisk, you can't escape. You don't belong here. You're just like them. This place will consume you. Asterisk, the words echoed inside his skull, growing louder, more insistent, until they drowned out everything else. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of encroaching blackness. Fear had taken over, and it was winning. Images flashed before him, sharp and vivid in the darkness, memories twisted into grotesque forms. He saw himself as a child, clutching the toy train, his grandfather standing behind him, his face obscured by shadow. He saw the fire, the raging inferno that consumed the workers, their screams ringing in his ears as their flesh melted away, revealing blackened skeletons reaching out for him, their bony fingers clawing at the air. He saw his own face, distorted and hollow, staring back at him from a cracked, soot-covered mirror. The reflection smirked, eyes glinting with malice. "You're next," it whispered. The mill's influence was warping his mind, pulling at the strings of his deepest fears and insecurities. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner of the room hiding some unspeakable horror. He felt something brush against his arm, soft, cold, like a caress. But when he looked, there was nothing there. His pulse quickened, his skin crawling with the sensation of being watched, of being hunted. The whispers grew louder, more aggressive, as if the very air around him was taunting him, mocking his helplessness. "You will never leave. You will never be free." Suddenly, the shadows began to shift, moving with purpose. They gathered around him, forming vague, humanoid shapes, their eyes burning with a cold, blue light. They didn't speak, but Michael could feel their intentions. They wanted him, to pull him into their realm, to make him one of them. Panic surged through him, his muscles tensing, but he couldn't move. The room had become a living nightmare, a distorted reflection of his own fears, and the mill was the architect of it all, feeding off his growing terror. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping him in a space that seemed to shrink with every passing second. And then the visions began. His mind twisted under the weight of the fear, and the mill's power began to show him things, or maybe it was manipulating his perception, distorting reality beyond recognition. He saw visions of the fire again, but this time, it wasn't just the workers who were burning. He saw himself standing in the center of Inferno, his clothes catching fire, his skin blistering and peeling away as he screamed in agony. He saw his own reflection in the eyes of the shadowy figures, their faces melting into his, until he couldn't tell where they ended and he began. The visions morphed into something even more horrifying. Michael standing in front of the same machines, but they were no longer just relics of the past. They were alive, churning out grotesque creations, twisted, burnt effigies of the workers who had died in the fire, their bodies deformed and their faces locked in eternal screams. The machines worked tirelessly, stitching together pieces of fabric stained with blood, creating a tapestry of horror that stretched out endlessly. And there, amidst the chaos, was the figure he had seen before, the gaunt, shadowy presence. Its eyes locked onto his, and in its gaze, Michael saw his own fate. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, until they became a cacophony of voices, all shouting at once, their words blending into a deafening roar. The fear was overwhelming now, pressing down on him like a physical weight, crushing his chest, making it impossible to breathe. His mind was unraveling, and the mill knew it. It was pushing him to the edge, testing his limits, waiting for him to break. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a new voice cut through the din. It was soft, almost soothing, but laced with something sinister. "Embrace it," the voice whispered. "The fear will set you free." Michael's pulse quickened as he felt the temptation creep into his mind. The mill wasn't just feeding on his fear, it was offering him a way out. A dark, twisted path that would mean surrendering to the terror, giving in to the madness. If he embraced it, if he allowed the fear to consume him, he could become part of the mill's dark history, a piece of the puzzle that had haunted his family for generations. The fear was tempting him, calling to him, offering him escape in exchange for his sanity. His hands shook as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, alive with anticipation, waiting for him to make his choice. The mill had shown him what it wanted: his fear, his soul, his very essence. It was tempting him to give in, to let the terror consume him completely. And in that moment, Michael realized that the fear wasn't just something external. It was a part of him, a reflection of his deepest, darkest thoughts. The mill had simply brought it to the surface. He was standing at the edge of an abyss, teetering on the brink of madness, and the darkness was calling to him. Embrace it, let in. The temptation was overwhelming, seductive in its simplicity. If he gave in, the fear would stop, the shadows would disappear, and the voices would go quiet. All he had to do was let go. But Michael knew deep down that once he crossed that line, there would be no coming back. The fear would own him, and the mill would claim him forever. With his heart pounding in his chest and the shadows closing in, Michael faced the ultimate temptation: surrender to the fear or fight to retain his last shred of humanity. Michael's body trembled with the weight of the fear pressing down on him. The mill seemed to pulse with life, each shadow around him shifting, whispering, and waiting for his next move. The temptation to give in was like a black hole, pulling at his mind with a force that felt impossible to resist. His thoughts spiraled as the dark voice echoed in his head. Embrace it. Let it take you. The fear will set you free. But even as his body felt paralyzed, as if rooted in the very soul of the mill, something inside him refused to surrender. There was a deeper truth hidden in the darkness, something more than fear itself, something connected to him. In the midst of the chaos, a memory flashed before his eyes. His grandfather, standing in front of a flickering fire, his face shadowed with regret, the same scar on his arm that now burned across Michael's skin. His voice, though distant, was clear in Michael's mind. The fire took more than just lives, Michael. It took something from me, something I can never get back, but you don't have to follow the same path. Michael's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. His grandfather had been here before. He had faced the same darkness, the same fear, but he had made a choice that had bound him to the mill, a choice that had scarred not only his body, but his soul. Michael's eyes flicked to the shadows writhing around him, and for the first time, he saw them for what they truly were. Not just remnants of a fire, not just ghosts trapped in their own torment, but reflections of the mill's ancient, malevolent will. The fire that had consumed the factory was no accident. It was a manifestation of the dark force that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. And now, that same force was reaching for him. The shadowy figure, the one that had watched him since his arrival, began to move closer. Its form shifted and twisted in the darkness, a grotesque amalgamation of charred flesh and smoke, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was the embodiment of the mill's dark power, the entity that had fed on the fear of the workers, the fire, and now Michael. But as it approached, something changed. Michael could feel a connection between them, an invisible thread that tied his fate to the mill and to his grandfather. The mill's whispers grew louder, insistent, trying to drown out the realization forming in his mind. This entity wasn't just a random evil. It was personal. The entity's voice was like a hiss, sharp and cold. You have always belonged to us, Michael. Your bloodline is tied to this place. Your grandfather tried to escape, but he failed. Now, it's your turn. The words sent a chill down Michael's spine, but there was something deeper behind them, something the entity wasn't saying. His thoughts raced as he pieced it together. His grandfather had made a bargain, a desperate deal to survive the fire, and in doing so, had bound himself and his descendants to the mill. The scar on Michael's arm was more than just a mark. It was a symbol of that bond, a curse passed down through the generations. Michael's breath quickened as the truth hit him like a wave. The entity wasn't just threatening him with death or torment. It was offering him the same bargain his grandfather had taken. Survive, but at a cost. But this time, Michael understood the consequences. The fear he felt wasn't just an emotion. It was the mill's weapon, a force it used to trap and control those who entered its domain. If he gave in to the fear, if he embraced the darkness, he would become part of the mill's cycle, another soul bound to its twisted will. The entity loomed over him now, its form towering, smoke billowing from its body like the flames of the fire that had destroyed the factory. The heat was oppressive, choking, as if the fire was being reignited around him. But Michael knew he couldn't let it control him. His mind cleared for a brief moment, and in that clarity, he saw the choice before him: to give in and take the deal, or to confront the darkness, to break the cycle that had haunted his family for generations. Michael's pulse quickened as he made his decision. He would not follow in his grandfather's footsteps. He would not be consumed by the mill's dark power. With a surge of defiance, he stepped forward, facing the entity head-on. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "I won't let you take me." The entity's eyes flashed with anger, and the shadows around Michael surged, trying to pull him down into the darkness. But he stood his ground, refusing to give in to the terror that clawed at his mind. The room began to shake, the walls creaking and groaning as the mill's power reached its peak. The flames that had once consumed the factory roared back to life. And for a moment, it seemed as if the entire building would collapse, into a blazing inferno. But Michael held on. He focused on his breath, on the steady beat of his heart, on the knowledge that the fear was a weapon, and he would not let it control him. The entity hissed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot escape, Michael." It snarled, but there was a note of desperation in its voice. "The fear is part of you. It always has been." Michael smiled grimly. "Maybe," he said, "but it doesn't own me." With a final, defiant step, Michael reached out and touched the entity. The moment his hand made contact, the world exploded into light. The shadows screamed, writhing in agony as the mill's power was shattered. The air crackled with energy, and the oppressive heat evaporated in an instant. The entity's form dissolved into smoke, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Michael felt the full force of the mill's dark will surge through him. But he held firm, refusing to let it take him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the room fell silent. The flames were gone, the heat extinguished. Michael stood alone in the mill, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted from his shoulders. The scar on his arm still burned, but it was different now. Not a mark of bondage, but of survival. The mill was silent, its power broken, but Michael knew the truth. The darkness would never fully disappear. It would always be there, waiting, lurking in the shadows. But for now, he had won. The silence that followed the dissolution of the entity was eerie, almost as if the mill itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Michael stood in the center of the room, heart still racing, his skin prickling with the remnants of fear that clung to the air. The shadows had retreated, but he knew it wasn't over. The darkness wasn't something that could be defeated so easily. The mill, with all its haunted history, wasn't done with him yet. He could feel it, a lingering presence, watching from the depths of the ruined building, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and the room was filled with an unnatural cold that sent a deep chill down his spine. His breath fogged in front of him as the oppressive atmosphere returned, thick and heavy. The walls, once still, now groaned as if the building itself were coming alive again, creaking and shifting. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and Michael could hear it, a distant rumble, like the sound of something deep underground stirring. The fire had taken its toll on the mill, but the true malevolence had been buried beneath the surface, waiting for someone to awaken it. And Michael had done just that. Without warning, the shadows surged forward once more, swirling around him like a dark, suffocating storm. The entity may have been weakened, but it was not destroyed. The mill was its domain, and here, it had power beyond comprehension. The room darkened, the only light coming from the faint, flickering embers that danced along the edges of the walls, like the dying remnants of a fire that refused to fully extinguish. The air was thick with smoke, and Michael's eyes burned as he tried to focus, his vision blurred by the growing haze. The mill wanted him gone, but not in the way he had feared. It wanted him consumed, another soul bound to its endless torment. The ground beneath him cracked with a loud, sickening snap, and suddenly, a massive fissure opened in the center of the room. Black smoke billowed out, thick and oily, as if the very heart of the mill had been ripped open to reveal the depths of its corruption. Michael staggered back, barely avoiding the jagged edges of the crack, but his gaze was locked on what lay below. Inside the fissure was a void, not just darkness, but something deeper, something alive. It pulsed and writhed, a swirling vortex of shadows that seemed to reach up, clawing at the edges of the opening, trying to pull itself free. From within that void, a figure began to rise. It wasn't the entity he had faced earlier. This was something far worse. Something ancient. Its form was indistinct, a mass of black smoke and twisted shadows, but its presence was overwhelming. It radiated malice, a pure and unrelenting evil that seemed to seep into the very air, turning it toxic. Michael could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, crushing him with a force that made it hard to breathe. This was the true source of the mill's power, the force that had been feeding on the fear and suffering of the workers for decades. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a sickly yellow light, piercing through the smoke and locking onto Michael with a gaze that chilled him to the bone. He could hear it now, not as a whisper, but as a roar, a voice so deep and malevolent that it reverberated through his very soul. "You have freed me, Michael," the voice hissed, dripping with venom. "And now you will join me." The figure's hand, long and clawed, reached out from the void, stretching impossibly toward him, closing the distance between them. Michael stumbled back, panic surging through him. He had thought the worst was over, but this was something far beyond what he had imagined. The ground beneath him cracked again, more fissures spreading out like the roots of a great tree, reaching across the floor as the mill itself began to fall apart. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the sound of groaning metal filled his ears as the building crumbled around him. But there was no escape. The mill had been designed to trap, to contain, and now it was closing in on him, intent on finishing what it had started. The figure loomed closer, its hand inches from Michael's chest, the air around it crackling with dark energy. Michael could feel his body growing weak, his strength draining as the shadows wrapped around him like chains, pulling him down toward the void. The fear he had fought so hard to overcome returned with a vengeance, gnawing at his mind, filling him with a terror so profound it threatened to consume him entirely. The figure's voice echoed in his ears, louder now, more insistent. "You cannot fight it, Michael. You are mine." But deep inside him, something stirred. The memories of his grandfather, the warnings, the scar on his arm, they all flashed before his eyes, and in that moment, Michael understood. The mill had been feeding on fear for generations, using it as a weapon to control and manipulate. But fear was only as powerful as the person who let it control them. His grandfather had made a choice, one born out of desperation and fear, but Michael still had the chance to make a different one. With a surge of adrenaline, Michael forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. The figure's hand brushed against his chest, and he could feel the cold, biting touch of death creeping into his skin. But he refused to let it take him. He reached out, grabbing the entity's wrist with both hands, the darkness burning his skin. But he held on. "I am not yours," Michael said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "You do not control me." The entity hissed, its eyes flaring with rage, but Michael held firm. He could feel the fear rising inside him, threatening to tear him apart, but he fought it with everything he had. The shadows wrapped tighter around him, but he pushed back, his grip tightening on the entity's wrist. The ground shook violently, and the fissures widened, but Michael refused to let go. "I am not afraid of you," he said, louder now, his voice gaining strength. "You are nothing but fear, and fear can be beaten." With a final, desperate cry, Michael pulled the entity forward and plunged it into the void from which it had come. The figure screamed, a high-pitched, agonized wail that pierced the air, but Michael didn't let go. He pushed the entity deeper into the fissure, the ground trembling beneath him as the shadows writhed and twisted around him. The air crackled with dark energy, the very walls of the mill shaking as the entity was dragged back into the void, its form dissolving into smoke and shadow. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows receded, the smoke dissipating, and the fissure slowly sealed itself, the ground closing with a final, resounding crack. The mill, once alive with the presence of evil, now stood silent and still. The darkness had been banished, but Michael knew that the mill's scars would never fully heal. It had claimed too many souls, and its history was stained with too much blood. Michael stood alone in the room, his body trembling with exhaustion. But he had won. The mill's hold on him was broken, the entity vanquished. But as he looked around the ruined factory, he knew that the darkness would never truly be gone. The mill still stood, silent and waiting, a relic of fear and suffering. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, it would always watch, waiting for its next victim. The mill was deathly silent now. The thick, oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the air was gone, but Michael could still feel a lingering unease, like the remnants of a nightmare that refused to fade upon waking. He stood in the ruins of the mill, his body aching from a final confrontation, his mind reeling from the terror he had just survived. The darkness, the entity, the evil that had consumed the souls of so many, it was gone. Or so it seemed. Yet, deep down, Michael knew that some things never truly disappear. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and scorched, evidence of the fissure that had opened moments before, now sealed as if it had never existed. The walls of the mill still groaned occasionally, settling after the chaos, but the malevolent presence that had pervaded the space was no longer pressing it on him. It should have been over. He should have felt relief. But instead, there was a gnawing sensation, something subtle but persistent, like the shadow of a hand reaching for him from the depths of the past. The air remained still, almost too still, and the hairs on the back of Michael's neck stood on end. Though the entity was gone, something about the mill still felt alive. The silence was heavy, not peaceful but watchful, as if the walls were still listening, still waiting. He scanned the room, every corner, every shadow, expecting movement. The factory machinery, rusted and broken, stood in eerie stillness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the mill was more than just an empty building. It was a monument to suffering, and that suffering had a way of leaving scars, not just on the building but on the souls who encountered it. Michael's thoughts drifted to his grandfather. He had survived this place too, but not without a cost. The scar on his arm had been more than a physical wound. It was a symbol of something deeper, a mark left not by fire, but by the darkness that had claimed so many before. And now, Michael bore the same scar. The burning sensation that had accompanied it had faded, but the memory of the pain remained. He wondered how much of his grandfather's fear had lived inside him all those years, festering, waiting for a moment like this. As Michael turned to leave, his footsteps echoed through the vast, empty space, the sound unnervingly loud in the absence of any other noise. The cold air bit at his skin as he stepped toward the entrance, the path to freedom finally clear. But just as he crossed the threshold, something stopped him in his tracks. A faint sound, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable in the silence. It was the soft, rhythmic click of a sewing machine, a sound that should not have been possible. The machines were dead, broken, yet the clicking persisted, faint but growing louder with each step he took away from the mill. Michael froze, turning slowly to face the interior once more. The sewing machines were still motionless, their rusted frames casting long shadows in the dim light. But the sound was undeniable now. It wasn't just in his head. The mill was alive again, if only for a moment, and it wanted him to know it. His pulse quickened as the clicking continued, the rhythmic sound echoing through the empty space like a heartbeat. Then, from deep within the bowels of the factory, he heard something else, a whisper, soft and faint, like a distant voice carried on the wind. The voice was unintelligible at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. But as he stood there, frozen in place, the words became clearer, sharper. "Michael, you cannot escape." The voice was distorted, as though coming from the depths of the earth itself, but it was undeniably real. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the words settled over him like a heavy fog. The entity had been vanquished, but the mill itself still held power. It was still watching, still reaching out for him. The ground beneath his feet rumbled, a low vibration that seemed to resonate from the very foundation of the building. Michael took a step back, panic rising in his throat. He had won, hadn't he? The entity was gone, defeated. But the mill wasn't just a vessel for that darkness. It was darkness itself. It had been feeding on the fear, the suffering of those trapped within its walls, for decades, maybe longer. And now, even without the entity, it lived on, an ancient evil too deeply rooted to ever truly die. Michael's breathing quickened as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, a chorus of the damned, all speaking in unison, their words weaving together in a haunting melody that chilled him to the bone. "You cannot leave. We are here, always here. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the voices, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the floor, creeping toward him like living tendrils of darkness. His instinct was to run, to flee the mill and never look back. But even as he backed away, he knew the truth. He would never be free. The mill had taken something from him, just as it had taken from his grandfather. A piece of his soul, a fragment of his fear, was forever bound to this place. No matter how far he went, how much time passed, the mill would always be there, lurking in the recesses of his mind, whispering in the dark. Michael turned and ran, the sound of his footsteps pounding against the cold, hard floor. The voices followed him, growing fainter as he sprinted through the ruined halls, but they never truly disappeared. Even as he burst through the doors and out into the cold night air, the faint echo of the whispers clung to him, a reminder that the mill's grip extended far beyond its physical walls. As he drove away, the mill's dark silhouette receded into the distance, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. In the rearview mirror, he saw it, a shadow, standing in the mill's doorway, its form barely discernible in the fading light. His heart skipped a beat, but when he blinked, it was gone. The road stretched out before him, empty and quiet, but the sense of dread lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The mill was behind him now, miles away, but its presence was imprinted on his very soul. He knew that no matter where he went, no matter how much distance he put between himself and Santa Clara, the darkness of the mill would always follow. It had claimed countless souls before him, and now it had claimed a piece of him too. The whispers would never stop. The shadows would never truly recede. And somewhere in the cold, crumbling ruins of the Santa Clara Textile Mill, the sewing machines still clicked, the voices still whispered, and the darkness waited. It would wait forever.